I'm hitting pause on all the coach talk. There's other things that the Sacramento Kings have to handle this offseason than just their head coach position, although head coach is probably the most important. But their starting two-guard spot, that's pretty important too. And could Terence Davis be one of the multiple options that are currently on this Kings roster that could fill that starting two-guard spot for the Kings? How much of a difference would Terence Davis had made if he was healthy the second half of the season after the Kings traded both Buddy Hield and Tyrese Halliburton, their two best shooters, away? We'll talk about it with Franklin Cartoscelli from the Return of the Roar podcast and Sports 1140 KHTK on today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season and all off season. If you're looking for in-depth analysis, game-by-game breakdowns, highlights, interviews with local and national experts, full coverage of your Sacramento Kings from January through December, this is the place for you, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. Just wrapped up my 8th season covering Kings basketball. This is year 5 for me hosting Locked On Kings, and I currently work for ABC 10 News in Sacramento. I used to work for Sports 1140 KHTK, where I met and became friends with my guest today, Franklin Cartoscelli from both Sports 1140 KHTK. He's a great writer over there covering the Sacramento Kings as well as a lot of Northern California sports. And Frankie also is the host of the Return of the Roar podcast with Chris Watkins, a great Sacramento Kings podcast for you to check out and listen to. I've been trying to get Frankie on Locked On Kings for a while to talk about specifically what we're talking about today. Yes, we will at the end of our conversation address the coaching search. So don't worry, we're not completely ignoring it. But Terence Davis, there's been a lot of chatter about Terence Davis and how much different the Kings would have looked, how much better their shooting would have been had Terence Davis been healthy the second half of the season or after the trade deadline, how he could fit with both De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis. There are many Kings fans that believe that potentially he's the answer to that starting two-guard hole that they have right now on the roster. Frankie and I are going to discuss that. We're going to look at Terence Davis's numbers, things that work for him, things that work against him, all that on today's episode of Locked On Kings. Okay, everybody, let's take a break for a little bit from all the Sacramento Kings coaching search stuff, all the drama, because that's not the only decision that Monte McNair has to make this offseason. It's probably the most important decision that he has to make, but he also has to fill out a roster. And there are two major holes right away that people are talking about. It's the starting two-guard spot and the starting four-guard spot, or rather four spot in the front court with Domantas Sabonis. That spot is going to have a lot of attention on it. We're going to talk about that a lot here on the Locked On Kings podcast over the next couple months because we have no idea how they're going to fill that spot. The starting two-guard spot, there could potentially already be multiple guys on this roster that could take that spot. And we've already talked a lot about Dante DiVincenzo, talked a lot about Davion Mitchell, but I've seen so many of you listeners in my comment section and on emails and Twitter saying, what about Terence Davis? Does Terence Davis have a legitimate shot at that starting two-guard spot? And then I saw Franklin Cartoscelli from Sports 1140 KHTK and the Return of the Roar podcast tweeting out similar things about what Terence Davis can provide. And I mean, he only played 30 games for the Sacramento Kings last season. But does Terence Davis have a legitimate shot of actually becoming the starting two-guard for the Sacramento Kings? Frankie and I are going to discuss that. Frankie, welcome back into Locked On Kings, my friend. Hope you are doing well. Everything's chaos with the coaching search right now. It's kind of nice to talk about actual basketball players.
Yeah, I kind of forgotten about the state of the roster, and I was looking over kind of just game logs and just looking back at some notable games from the season, and Terence Davis's big 35-point game came up, and I just said, okay, well, I kind of forgot about him because the last time we saw Terence Davis was when the Kings were getting absolutely destroyed by, what they lose by 50 points to the Boston Celtics. And in that game, TD, he hurt his wrist and we never saw him again the rest of the year. So it's fun to just kind of take it, like you said, a breather from the coaching search because it is kind of exhausting. And I'm glad that we're moving towards a resolution on that front. I'm sure we're going to get into that a little later on. But yes, some pressing questions need to be answered as far as the roster goes. And like you said, the shooting guard is, in my opinion, probably the most important position maybe even above the power forward position.
Interesting. Well, we heard a lot from Kings broadcasts, both television and radio, and I talked to G-Man about this. The Kings had very clear issues with shooting at the end of the season, with trading away Buddy Hield. Harrison Barnes clearly became their best shooter. Even Tyrese Halliburton being traded, he was one of the top shooters on the team as well. So many broadcasters, G-Man, Katie, Mark, I heard them, Kyle, even saying, man, Terence Davis would make such a big difference for this team. And on paper, I understand that, but I'm curious, did you see that whole shooting wise? Do you see that as something that Terence Davis, yes, he can help it, but help it so significantly that it wouldn't have been as big of a problem as it clearly was in the second half of the year?
Yeah, I mean, I think he would have helped for sure. I think he would have done a better job as far as some of the other options the Kings had shooting. Dante DiVincenzo struggled at times. He looked good at times. It was a little inconsistent, but we know he was working his way back from injury. I think we all can agree that Justin Holiday, we would have liked to see a little less of Justin Holiday down the closing stretch of the season, and I'm sure that nobody's in the camp of wanting him to be the starting two guard next season or even the bench two guard next season, really. Veteran depth is something the Kings could look for Holiday, but I don't want him to be playing 30 minutes per game anymore. But TD, I think he would have brought a little more than just shooting. I mean, his energy, it was so valuable to the Kings early on. I think I tweeted early in the season that he reminded me of a Bobby Jackson type energy. Not saying TD's Bobby Jackson, but the type of energy they brought where Bobby Jackson would always just play with 110% effort. He was always sprinting all across the floor. Didn't have any questions about his defense. And TD, the metrics say he was one of the better defenders on the team last year, which is why sometimes people compared TD and Buddy a little bit. I think that TD can shoot the ball well, nowhere near as good as Buddy on a good day, but they have some tendencies to kind of pull up or chuck. TD chucked a little less than Buddy, but he had some moments. But the fact that TD could also play defense as well made it more of in my mind, a feasible opportunity for the Kings to have a guy on the court that can defend and knock down a three when needed be. But the energy in my mind is invaluable.
The defense, the optics of the defense, I think is very interesting to me because when you put Terence Davis next to Buddy Hield, like it's night and day difference because Buddy Hield didn't play an ounce of defense. Even when you put Terence Davis next to De'Aaron Fox, to some extent, you saw a big significant defensive difference. If you're making a decision for your starting two spot and it's between Terence Davis and both Davion Mitchell, who I'm kind of out on as a starting two, even though I like what he does. I like him better as almost like that Bobby Jackson six man, like you were just talking about, or Dante DiVincenzo. I wonder if there's a drop off defensively. Like we see, okay, maybe he's not as good of a defender as we thought. Those are questions that are probably going to be answered come like training camp and preseason when we get our first look at these guys. But I wonder if defensively, Terence Davis is as good as we saw this season, or if he just looked better because in that spot you were getting zero defense from Buddy Hield.
Yeah, it's tough to compare, right? So it would have been nice to have him a part of those lineups down the closing stretch where Buddy Hield was no longer a part of the roster because the only times we've seen Terence Davis play basketball on the Sacramento Kings, Buddy Hield's been a part of the roster as well. And we saw TD even the end of last season, the 2020-21 season, TD was playing big minutes down the stretch and playing very well. I think that you could make a case that he played his way. Well, obviously he played his way into a multi-year contract, a 2-year deal, but he also played his way into, he had a rotation spot near the beginning of the season. So it's going to be interesting to see how he does play defensively on a roster next to De'Aaron Fox. If he plays next to Davion Mitchell, if the Kings still bring Davion off the bench as a starting point guard next year, and that's kind of your 1-2 off the bench, we're going to find out. And if we get to 10, 15, 20 games in the season next year and that defense is not looking very good, then we're having another issue. But again, like you said, as far as Davion Mitchell starting at the 2 or what have you, there's a lot of questions that need to be resolved, and the rotation, who knows what it could look like opening night. But I was impressed by the defensive efforts I saw from Terence Davis because of how much worse it made Buddy Hield look, which I guess that could be a silver lining, if anything, just the fact that there's not multiples of Buddy Hields on the roster.
Two main things that I appreciate about Terence Davis. Number one, he's versatile. Like, you could see him starting next to Fox. You could see him coming off the bench next to Davion, depending upon what you want to do with Dante DiVincenzo. And we're all assuming, I think at this point, that DiVincenzo is going to return. I would be shocked if he didn't. Which is why I'm referencing DiVincenzo so much in this conversation and giving DiVincenzo at this time the leg up on Terence Davis. I also love how valuable Davis is contract-wise. Like, he's coming into the second year of his 2-year deal that he signed with the Kings. He's being paid $4 million. So there's two things there. One, he's not taking a large chunk of cap space for doing a lot of what Buddy Hield provided this team without just chucking up a million threes a game and playing absolutely no defense. And I'm not trying to throw stray bullets at Buddy Hield, but we know what it was here. But also, as an expiring contract, Terence Davis has value too. So should Monty McNair look to upgrade at that position, he has too many two guards. Terence Davis could be a guy that easily could be moved on from for value, either this offseason or even next season. Not that I'm necessarily rooting for that, but Frankie, looking at the numbers for Terence Davis, like in 30 games, he started in 11 games for the Kings. He averaged just over 10 points a game, which dropped slightly from just over 11 points per game last season with the Kings, but he got a lot of minutes towards the end of the season when the Kings were pretty banged up. And even though those games were somehow still meaningful, Terence Davis got a lot of time there to shine after being traded to the Kings. It's only a 27-game sample size. What to me is most important when looking at these 10 points is the fact that he did that in just shy of 18 minutes per game. So there's efficiency there. If he's scoring 10 points in 25, 26 minutes, then that's a big difference from 10 points in 17, 18 minutes. I do want to talk about his per 36 numbers too, because that actually might work against him a little bit in the argument for him as a starter. But what those numbers show is that Davis doesn't need a lot of time to have an effect offensively, and this team could use that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you'll get the splits, and I think you're going to get into those a little later on, but I'll just kind of just throw this one out there. And like you said, starter maybe isn't the right role for him. In my opinion, I'll put it out there. I don't want Terence Davis to be the starting two guard next season. I feel like he'd be a great piece off the bench. I don't think he's the answer as the starter, but looking at the last year's splits, 20 to 29 minutes per game, he had only 7 games, limited sample size, mind you, but when he played in those 7 games, he was playing 27 minutes per game, averaging 17.6 points per game, 5.1 boards, shooting 48% from the field, 41% from 3. That's kind of like his sweet spot, I think. If you get in that 20 to 25 minute range, in my mind, that could be really valuable for this Kings team. And what we look at now with a Kings team that doesn't have Buddy Hield, who we've been kind of throwing stones at, of course, but we can go ahead and just say he was the Kings' best bench scorer the last 2 seasons. They need a scoring punch off the bench. And Davion Mitchell has done a great job of that. Now, that was in the starting lineup, mind you, near the end of the year when he was going on that crazy tear. We don't really know if that's going to be what he can bring off of the bench, if that's his role next year. But if the Kings need a bench scorer next season, and this is going off of TD, the Kings could go out and make a trade for some other 6-man of the year candidate that we don't know of. But I'm comfortable bringing in a guy like Terence Davis to play 20, 25 minutes off the bench, who can defend at an average to near above average level, and knock down a 3. And I'm very comfortable with that.
Quick pause here as I tell you about a great sponsor of Locked On Kings. That is Built Bar. Summer is coming, and with summer, you're going to need some food on the go. Built Bars are the perfect snack to take with you on family vacations, family outings. If you're going golfing like I do, I always bring Built Bars with me, one to eat right at the turn and one to eat after the round, usually to console myself after a horrible score. The best part about Built Bars, they're healthy and delicious. You don't have to sacrifice delicious food for health. With Built Bar, you can have both, and it's easy. All you have to do is go to Built.com and order right now. You can get one of their bars or a bunch of their bars in a multitude of flavors that you like. And truly, they taste like candy bars. It's not an exaggeration. Or you can try their new puffs, these protein-infused marshmallows. It's a real thing. They're delicious. They come in great flavors like banana cream pie and even churro. Who doesn't want a protein bar that tastes like a churro? Come on now. Only 140 calories. Sign me up. And most Built Bars are only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar. It's an absolute blowout. Go to Built.com. Use promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off whatever you order. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. People love the per 36 numbers because they make your numbers look really, really good. I view it more as almost a stat pimping or stat boosting type of I guess section of the box score or section of numbers, because it's unrealistic in a lot of ways. And the reason why I want to point this out in the per 36 minutes of Terence Davis is you see his per 36 minutes this season, he would have averaged just shy of 21 points per game. Absolutely love that. It doesn't affect his shooting much. He's scoring per 36, 21 points per game while still shooting just 32% from 3-point range and 42% from the field. So what does that mean? That means in per 36 situations, he's taking almost 18 field goals a game, taking almost 3 3-pointers a game. That's never going to happen on this roster. So the per 36 numbers that's not really accurate in this conversation, because if the Kings could get Terence Davis to average 20 points per game, hell yeah, he's a starter and they're probably a really good basketball team. But what these numbers are saying is that in order for Davis to get to that point, playing 36 minutes a game, he'd have to chuck up Buddy Hield numbers of field goal attempts. And I would argue that would make the Sacramento Kings worse. So I want to go back to what you said, Frankie. You said that you wouldn't start Terence Davis at the 2. And I'm as of right now in the same boat, although I'm willing for there to be competition and him being part of that competition for that spot. Looking at the 3 names that we've already talked about, Davis, DiVincenzo, and Mitchell. Any one of those 3 guys give you the confidence that, yes, they can be, or one of those guys can be the starting 2 guard for the Sacramento Kings next season on a team that we expect to compete for a legitimate playoff spot? Or do you think McNair needs to look for that starter upgrade still?
I'm fully in the, Monty McNair has said over and over, he'll upgrade the roster and make the best move possible, whether it's in the draft, free agency, what have you. We've seen him draft the same position multiple years in a row. Now, the one thing the Kings really need, they need shooters. They really need an established knockdown shooter. Buddy Hield's gone. Tyrese Halliburton is gone. Harrison Barnes, I love what he did from behind the arc this year, but I don't think we can say he's the Kings, he can't be the Kings shooter. They need a knockdown threat. Can Donte DiVincenzo be that? I would like to think he can kind of go back to where he was with Milwaukee, where he was a starting 2 guard on a championship team before he got hurt. He was so valuable to that team during that run. If he can turn back into that, I'm all for it. That's a what if. We'll see what the Kings, shell out as far as contracts go and how his recovery goes this offseason and kind of his road back. But if the Kings can swing a trade for a starting caliber 2 guard that is a knockdown threat, that's what the Kings need, in my opinion. And yeah, I did say that that's prioritized over the power forward position. I think the power forward is a very, very important position to fill as well, but there's some flexibility there, because if they do keep HB, we do see that lineups in the NBA nowadays, they go smaller. And while that's not probably a very preferable move to a lot of people to play HB at the 4 in some sets, imagine playing HB at the 4 in some sets next to Sabonis with Fox, a knockdown 3-point threat at the 2, and maybe you go DiVincenzo or Davis at the 3 in some sets like that. I'm okay with that. So I would be surprised if the Kings don't go into next season with another 3-point threat. Now, it could be a starting caliber player or a bench player, but they need to upgrade shooting this offseason.
That leads really well into my next question about the Kings going small. If McNair is to add a starting caliber 2 guard or another 2 guard-esque shooter, let's say, I'm going to throw out a name out there. I don't know if he's necessarily starting caliber. I think he joins the competition right away, but I've heard a lot of people and seen a lot of people talking about like Malik Monk, right? Let's say Malik Monk is brought into Sacramento. Or I had a conversation with Jesse from ESPN 1320. He's their producer. I had a conversation with him about whether or not the Kings could potentially go out and get Victor Oladipo this offseason. Oladipo is probably going to be a cheap option. I don't know if anybody would look at him as a savior for the franchise. Obviously, his injury history, but that's an option that McNair could go out and get. Terence Davis, no matter what, is if he's still on this team, he's going to have a role in some capacity. But how comfortable are you with the idea of Davis and even DiVincenzo sliding down and playing a significant amount of minutes at that 3 spot in the rotation?
We saw a little bit of it this past year. I mean, like you said, we're seeing it more in the NBA as a whole. The Golden State Warriors have kind of, and I guess the Houston Rockets back when they were playing PJ Tucker at the 5. I don't think I want to get that creative with it. I don't want to play Harrison Barnes at the 5. But we're seeing it more in the NBA nowadays. And I think having a 6'4", 6'5" option like DiVincenzo and Davis to slide down and play the 3 especially the way that those guys defend, and specifically DiVincenzo, the defensive intensity we saw from him, which was really fun to watch while he was in Sacramento. I think that definitely is something that could work out. I mean, will it work out every single night in every single matchup? No, that's the way the sport goes. But I think the Kings can hang their hat on a lineup that includes having another solid threat on the perimeter at the 2, Fox, DiVincenzo, Barnes, Sabonis. I mean, I'm fully okay, and I'm on board with that. Like, I don't think that's a bad lineup. It all kind of just depends on the situation and the matchups, but we're seeing it a lot in the NBA, and I'm all for it.
I said this a lot, especially towards the end of the season. One of the things that McNair needs to do this offseason is limit the amount of fringe talent on this Kings roster. And I don't just mean fringe talent like players who could have roles in the NBA, but are also really good in the G League. Like, I'm not talking about those Damian Jones, Chimezie Metu-esque fringe talent, although I would argue Damian Jones might honestly have graduated out of that with how well he played for the Kings. And I think he could be a rotation big in maybe every team or on every team in the NBA at this point. But
I agree.
To me, Terence Davis is not a fringe talent in that sense. Terence Davis would have a role on this team. Terence Davis would have a role on almost every NBA team. He is definitely an NBA player, but he is a fringe starting talent, as is Davion Mitchell, as is, I guess, even though he started for years on the championship Bucks program, as is Dante DiVincenzo. Hell, as would be Victor Oladipo or Malik Monk, those 2 options. Like, what do you think about fringe talent in Sacramento and the need for the Kings to come into the season with 5 established NBA starters? Should that be a priority in your mind for McNair? And do you see DiVincenzo or Davis able to work their way up to that established NBA starter status?
I think it's always a priority. It's always been a priority for this team. It's a lot easier said than done, right? I mean, the Kings would love to have rostered a fully NBA starting caliber 5 for the past 16 years now, but it's not the way it works. And yeah, I mean, you could go with a guy like Victor Oladipo, who I guess what I was going to say is it's more of a risk and reward situation. Like, the Kings have struck gold before. They struck gold in signing Rashawn Holmes to a contract, who was kind of a fringe rotation guy. He turned into a starting caliber center, and he might get a new home this summer, but he is a starting caliber center. Nemanja Bjelica was somebody who was almost out of the league. He almost went and signed in Europe, and he was a starting power forward that was shooting 40% from 3, a top 8 shooter. And he's out of the rotation in Golden State, but he's been a big part of that team.
Yeah.
I think the Kings, they can go either way. They can go out, and what do you have to give up to acquire a legitimate talent? Could it be Davion Mitchell? Could it be the draft pick? Could it be multiple picks for a star caliber 2 or 4? That's something that could happen. I think that's realistic. But they also could look the other way and try to find some of those bargain deals and strike gold again. That could be Victor Oladipo. That could be maybe they pay Bobby Portis a little more, who I think he's established he can start and not kind of sit in the shadow of Brook Lopez there in Milwaukee. Maybe that's something the Kings look to do again. They look to go out and strike gold and sign somebody to a deal and hope they can grow them into something more so, because it is Sacramento and they do have that opportunity. But I do think that Terence Davis is kind of in that boat too. He's a guy that needs to, is he a starter? Is he a fringe guy? Is he a strike gold and he's going to average 15, 16 points per game off the bench next year? Is he going to be a starter that underperforms? That's what they need to find out. They need to find out. And the way you find that out is by giving these guys a chance to play. And I think he'll get that if he's here.
Okay, Frankie, we can't ignore it any longer. Kings coaching search going on right now. First question I have for you. Does it feel like this is being rushed? Like, we were in the building when McNair said in his postseason press conference that they were going to take their time. They were going to do a full coaching search. And look, if you know your guy or you have your finder candidates, I guess you move on before another team can swoop them up. But we're not even through the conference semifinals, and already the Kings have their list of finalists. Like, does this feel rushed to you or pretty standard?
It feels, I don't know if it feels rushed. It just feels frantic, I guess, is rushed. It does feel a little rushed, I guess. It just feels like things have really come to a head so quickly. And we had about a week and a half ago that list. It was a long list that included, Darvin Ham, some other guys from around the league that are young up and comers, and all of a sudden, just snap. It's 3 finalists, and it's 3 guys who they aren't the sexiest coaching candidates to the eyes and ears. And I think it's kind of really spiraled the past couple of days because of the reports we've been seeing about Vivek Ranadive, who's in charge of this decision. A lot of leaks that are kind of eyebrow raising. Just they're coming from places I'm sure that aren't the most. I don't know if they have the Kings' best interest at heart. So it's getting to a point where I'm ready for it to be over. Now the ending that is coming might be one I'm not happy about, but I'm hoping that I'm wrong. But yeah, I would say, to come to think of it, it's been a little frantic the past, what's today? Wednesday? The past 72 hours have been a little frantic.
When I saw the list of finalists, the word that I used was underwhelming. And before we get to the reports and the news that you're alluding to of who Vivek prefers, out of these three, who does Franklin Cartoscelli prefer?
I am fully on the Crown Brown movement.
Oh, okay. I've never heard the Crown Brown movement. I guess I'm on it too. Crown Brown. I'm in.
Crown Brown. I mean, I've been doing a lot of reading about just what he's brought to that Golden State Warriors team, and I didn't really have an idea of his track record as a defensive coach. Even when he was with, obviously, the Cleveland Cavaliers, the LeBron James led Cleveland Cavaliers, but those teams were famous for not being very deep, but they still played defense. They were a very good defensive team while he was in Cleveland. Even his 1 year in Los Angeles, they were a top half of the league defensive team, and they were a fringe playoff team. So just seeing that he's been like kind of the architect of this Warriors defense, and he's taken the reins of that end, and seeing that they've become arguably the best defensive team in the league, I am fully on board with it. And I think as far as coaching candidates go, I can talk myself into Steve Clifford. I can find a way to make that work. I mean, just the guy I am, I'll say, okay, well, let's see what we can pull out of this as positive. But I will feel actually good about it if they hire Mike Brown. I think Mike Brown deserves another shot. His track record, I know that the Lakers' tenure didn't go perfectly. The Cavs, we know that they had LeBron James, who was 24, 25 at the time, just setting the world on fire. But he's been a huge part of these Warriors championship teams, and I think he deserves a look. But the Mark Jackson cloud is looming over the city of Sacramento, and yeah, I don't know if things are going to happen the way we want them to work. I'm sure you're going to allude to next, that the reports, things seem split. Things seem split as far as Monty McNair and what Vivek want. So that's always fun.
I'm gonna delay talking about that a little bit more because I want to ask you one more question about Brown, and I'm in the same boat. To me, Mike Brown is my clear pick out of the three. And in reality, Frankie, I see this as a two-man race. As much as I like Steve Clifford, and I like you could talk myself into, okay, Steve makes sense. Like, I don't think Steve Clifford has much of a shot. I think this is Brown versus Jackson at this point in time. Hence the reason why Clifford went first. He was the opening act in the interviews, and they kind of got him out of the way, at least in my opinion. But let me ask you this. I asked this question to Kyle Madsen from 95.7 The Game. We had a good long conversation about both Mark Jackson and Mike Brown with his knowledge of the Golden State Warriors and their history. How much different is Mike Brown from Alvin Gentry, really? Like, we're talking about two extremely well-respected coaches. For one, the one thing I will say is that Gentry took over in the middle of the season. He didn't have the time to implement much different than what Luke Walton was doing. So, like, Gentry never really got a fair shot to establish himself here in Sacramento. He made whatever changes he could. But Brown is going to have the time to come in here day one and hopefully have multiple years to kind of establish his system. Gentry's more offensive-minded. Brown's more defensive-minded. But in terms of kind of safe, well-respected players, coaches in the NBA, like, I don't know if I see Brown having significant success compared to if Alvin Gentry had kept the job.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it just depends on what needs that needed to be addressed. I mean, the offense hasn't really been an issue with the Kings, and that offense still wasn't a problem under Alvin Gentry. Now, you can look at the fact that Alvin Gentry came in and
it was bad last year. They were like bottom half of the league. Yeah, offense was bad last year too.
The offense was bad too, but not as bad as the defense, I guess.
Sure, absolutely. That's not comparable.
the offense, the Kings have scores. They have De'Aaron Fox. They have Domantas Sabonis. They have Davion Mitchell as a stopper, but other than that, there wasn't really a really good defensive player on the team, and that's the difference to me. Is the fact that a new head coach, whether I hope it's Mike Brown, also will get to come in and pick his own staff. Now, who will be on that staff? That'll be interesting to see how that fills out. I was reading reports today about I think it was Luke Walton wanted to hire Brian Shaw as his lead assistant back when he was hired, and was told no because of salary implications. So we'll see who he wants to bring in. At this point, if you're wanting to end this playoff drought, let the man fill out the roster with the coaching roster with the guys that he wants.
Agreed.
But the difference between Gentry and Brown to me would be defense, and that's only because the Kings have needed defense for literally 16 years. That is the Achilles heel of this team since 2006, and they haven't had a defensive rating better than 20th since the playoff drought started. It needs a change, and I think it's going to start with who they bring in. And I know that they're saying that Clifford and Jackson, by they I mean reports, are saying that the Kings have eyes on those two guys because they also had defensive tendencies. But I think that if you're trying to bring in the best defensive minded coach, it has to be Brown.
You reported that Mark Jackson is in town. We knew he was coming to town for his in-person interviews, the second round of interviews. You reported that yesterday he was actually in the building talking with Vivek and talking with McNair. And we heard you kind of alluded to the dark cloud of Mark Jackson over the organization. Can you, before we even talk about the Vivek involvement, and we'll save that for last, can you talk about just your personal feelings on Mark Jackson, someone who on the floor had a lot of success, but comes with a lot of drama and baggage, drama that I've said I don't think is worth it, regardless of if he's moved on over these 8 years or not? Like, talk to me a little bit about what is it about Mark Jackson that makes you so hesitant?
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and I wish I didn't have to hold all the things that are surrounding him against him because of the fact that he was a good basketball player. I think he was I don't think he was a bad coach by any means. It's just when it comes to the Sacramento Kings, what they've been for the past better part of 2 decades, the distractions that have come with the playoff drought, the distractions that have come with the turmoil surrounding DeMarcus Cousins when he was here, George Karl, Marvin Bagley, Buddy Hield. There's even more I'm sure I'm forgetting. Luke Walton. I mean, there's
Yeager and Williams.
All these clashes and drama, these things that happen, there's one a season minimum. And I think bringing in a clear distraction who is only being, in my mind, looked to as a serious candidate because Vivek Ranadive was a minority owner of the Golden State Warriors during that time. And someone who we know is fascinated by the Golden State Warriors and wants the Kings to become the Warriors.
Yeah.
That's what I have a problem with. I don't think that this is purely a basketball related. It's not. There's no correlation in my mind. I think it's Vivek Ranadive is a Golden State Warriors fanatic at heart. And that's what he knows. That's what he knows about the game of basketball. That's what introduced him to the game of basketball was the Golden State Warriors in the early 2010s. And Mark Jackson was a big part of that. Now, again, I feel bad holding this against him because I'm sure he is going to be deserving of a head coaching job down the line, and maybe he will get one. Maybe it'll be here, but I would rather take the Sacramento Kings' best interest, in my mind, the best interest for this organization, the fan base, the playoff drought, everything is to bring in the best coaching candidate available. And I just don't think that it's Mark Jackson.
I'll say for me, I think I could be talked into Mark Jackson being a good basketball coach that could help this Kings team the same way he started what became the Warriors dynasty and got them off to the right foot. And look, he had a lot of respect in that locker room. Steph has still defended him. Draymond liked him. So it's not like he alienated himself with his players, which is of course extremely important. He just alienated himself with the entire front office and basically the rest of the organization, which is obviously not great. There have been 2 reports, Frankie, of Vivek being very impressed with Mark Jackson. One of them saying that he was Vivek's favorite to land the job. In that same report, we heard that Mike Brown was McNair's favorite. Regardless of who's favorite, who liked who, regardless of where this information was coming from, and I agree with you that it's coming from someone who doesn't have the best interest of the Sacramento Kings in mind. That, or it's coming from an agent who's trying to get their client, their candidate to look better. But we have no proof of either. Either way, it doesn't look great for Vivek. It doesn't look great for the Sacramento Kings. To me, regardless of where that information came from, I believe it's true to some extent, but maybe not as drastic as we're making it out to be. Regardless, all that mattered to me was, once again, I was seeing Vivek Ranadive's name involved in this. And we all knew that Vivek was going to be involved in interviews. We all knew that Vivek's opinion was going to be involved in this decision. But what was number one, the most important thing about this decision is that it's Monte McNair's and McNair's alone. And the fact that the first report that we got about this search had Vivek's name on it and Monte's not sent alarm bells ringing in my head, even if that source didn't come from the Kings or Vivek himself. So I've talked enough about it. I've ranted about it. I've even calmed down about it lately because I know, or I have an idea of where those sources are coming from. But regardless, Frankie, seeing Vivek even remotely involved in this decision, even introducing the idea that, once again, it's not the general manager making this call, it's ownership. What does that do for you and your thoughts of the future of this organization?
You know, I look back to when Vivek was starting off with the Kings 2013, 2014 in that area, and he used to say it in these press conferences. He'd say it repetitively. He'd say, what I do is I get people in the room that are smarter than me as far as the basketball side. And to that I say, prove it. Let's let them do their job. And it's very like you, Matt, I'm also like very frustrated by it, because why haven't hired a general manager then if it's going to come back to you shooting down these decisions and telling Pete D'Alessandro to draft Nick Stauskas and do all these other decisions that Vivek has been a part of over the years. These reports also sent alarms off in my head, because the fact that Vivek Ranadive has had an affinity for Mark Jackson. Mark Jackson's name has come up in coaching searches for the Kings every time the Kings have had an opening over the past 9 years. And this is the furthest it's gone. And it's really, really scary, because you have to ask yourself the question, would Mark Jackson have made it this far if Vivek Ranadive really was, okay, I'm gonna let you guys handle this, you bring in the guys you want? Would Mark Jackson really be sitting here right now if it wasn't for Vivek Ranadive's pushing? Do you think that? Because I don't. So I'm at a point where I would like Vivek Ranadive to prove it. Prove that you bring in these guys who you say are the smartest basketball minds in the room, and let them do their jobs. And I feel like that the reports that Monte McNair has final say, I don't want to say they've been false, but I just feel like maybe there's an asterisk in there. Monte McNair has full control over Kings basketball rate decisions, asterisk, unless Vivek Ranadive really wants to put his input in. Then in that case, it's his decision too. I want to see. There's no clause. There's no there's no loophole where Vivek Ranadive can make this decision. It needs to be Monte McNair, Wes Wilcox, the Kings front office. They should be picking their next head coach. And like we've seen in that same report from Jake Fisher, their jobs will be on the line if it doesn't work out. So let's do it the way things go in the sports world. Let your guys, whether it be your players, your executives, your coaches, do their jobs. If it doesn't work out, you reassess, but give it a shot to work first, to work or not. So I'm super, super intrigued to see how this pans out. I think we'll have an answer in the next couple of days, honestly. It could be by the end of the weekend. I would not be surprised. So
I was just going to say, I don't think we're going to have to wait very long to get some kind of answer to this whole situation. And then that means that, Frankie, you're going to have to come back here on Locked On Kings with me, plus do the work that you do for Return of the Roar. And I'm sure we're all going to have opinions on whatever decision the Sacramento Kings make. Even if it's a Mike Brown or a Steve Clifford, there are definitely going to be things to criticize about it. There are going to be some things to praise about it. There will be some things to praise about a Mark Jackson hire too, although that list not nearly as long as Mike Brown, at least in both of our opinions. But Frankie, whatever happens with that, whatever happens with Terence Davis, player personnel, this is not going to be the last time that we chat here during the offseason. Really appreciate you taking the time to come on, my man. Can't wait to do it again with you.
Thank you, Matt. Let's all give ourselves a good luck pat on the back for this coaching search. We're almost done.
Huge thank you to Frankie for joining me on today's Locked On Kings podcast. Always a pleasure to have him on, and we definitely will have him back to talk about whatever decision the Kings make at that head coach spot, whatever decision they make with Terence Davis in that starting two-guard spot, any roster decisions that they make. Frankie is a frequent guest on Locked On Kings for a reason. Can't wait to have him back on, and I really appreciate him joining me today. Hope you enjoyed that conversation. I want to hear your thoughts on Terence Davis, the confidence that you potentially have in him to be the starting two-guard. Are you a little more hesitant, like Frankie and I, that he could be that starting two-guard? Do you think the Kings should look to potentially move him and try and capitalize on his expiring contract value that he has? Where are you at with Terence Davis? And then, of course, where are you at with this coaching search? Let me know at MattGeorgeSack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com, and leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. Really appreciate you joining me on today's Locked On Kings podcast, of course. Next episode, I do have to address this Joe Dumar situation. Joe Dumar's, who is Vivek's latest advisor and did carry an actual role in Sacramento. He has left the Kings to go and actually work for the NBA itself. And he left the Kings after multiple attempts of trying to kind of seize basketball decision-making power. He wanted to be ahead of or above Monte McNair and have McNair report to him. Thankfully, Kings owner Vivek Ranadive wasn't for it, according to Sam Amick. We'll talk about that, plus whatever Kings news comes from this this coaching search and more still to come this week on Locked On Kings. So I hope you will join me for that. I appreciate you as always. Can't wait to have you join me on the next one. Until then, my name is Matt George. You've been listening to Locked On Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.